The mongrel mob, which would become one of New Zealand's largest and most notorious criminal organisations, had its origins in the Hawke's Bay region on the North Island's east coast in the early 1960s. The exact circumstances of the gang's formation remain somewhat obscured by conflicting accounts and the passage of time, but what is clear is that the mongrel mob emerged from street fighting groups of predominantly Maori youth in the twin cities of Hastings and Napier. These cities, located in a prosperous agricultural region known for its orchards and vineyards, had experienced the same patterns of Maori urbanization that affected larger centres, with families migrating from rural areas to seek employment in seasonal agricultural work and food processing industries. By the early 1960s, substantial Maori populations had concentrated in working-class neighbourhoods in both cities, facing the familiar challenges of limited employment opportunities, inadequate housing, and social marginalisation. The young men who would form the core of the mongrel mob were products of this environment. Most had left school early. Many had already accumulated minor criminal records for offences such as theft and assault, and nearly all had been involved in street fights between groups from different neighbourhoods or schools. What distinguished these particular individuals was their willingness to formalise their association and adopt the trappings of a permanent organisation rather than remaining a loose collection of friends who occasionally fought together. The name mongrel mob itself reflected both defiance and a deliberate embrace of marginalisation. The term mongrel was commonly used as a derogatory insult in New Zealand at the time, applied to people of mixed race or those considered to be of low social status. By adopting this term as their identifier, the founding members were rejecting mainstream society's values and claiming pride in their outsider status. The choice of mob similarly indicated an intention to form a lasting collective organisation rather than a temporary youth gang. The development of the gang's symbolism and colours occurred gradually through the mid to late 1960s. The bulldog became the primary symbol of the mongrel mob, an animal associated with aggression, tenacity, and loyalty. Members began wearing patches on their jackets depicting bulldogs, initially in various styles, before a more standardized design emerged. The gang's colors were established as red, a choice that would later take on additional significance as the mongrel mob expanded and came into conflict with rival gangs who adopted different colors to distinguish themselves. More controversially, some early mongrel mob members incorporated Nazi imagery and symbolism into their patches and tattoos. The swastika and other Nazi symbols appeared on some members' patches, and the gang developed a practice of giving members German military-style nicknames and titles. This appropriation of Nazi symbolism has been explained variously as reflecting ignorance of the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities, as a deliberate attempt to adopt the most offensive and shocking imagery possible to express rejection of mainstream society, or as admiration for what members perceived as symbols of power and fear. Whatever the motivation, this aspect of mongrel mob culture generated significant public revulsion and contributed to the gang's reputation as beyond the bounds of acceptable society. The early activities of the mongrel mob centered on street fighting, initially against loosely organized rival groups and later against emerging structured gangs. Violence was both a means of establishing territorial control over neighborhoods and suburbs, and an end in itself, as gang culture valorized physical toughness and willingness to fight. Members were expected to demonstrate their commitment to the gang through participation in violent confrontations, and reputations within the organization were built on fighting prowess and fearlessness. Petty crime was also endemic among early mongrel mob members, though at this stage the gang had not developed the organized criminal enterprises that would later generate substantial income. Theft, burglary, and receiving stolen goods were common activities, often undertaken individually or in small groups rather than as coordinated gang operations. Alcohol featured prominently in gang culture, with heavy drinking being both a social activity and frequently a precursor to violence. The gang structure in its early years was relatively informal, with leadership based on personal dominance and fighting ability, rather than any formal hierarchy. Certain individuals emerged as leaders within local groups through their willingness to initiate violence, their success in fights, and their ability to command respect through intimidation. These leaders were accorded titles and deference by other members, though their authority was always somewhat contingent on their ability to maintain their position through continued demonstrations of toughness. By the late 1960s, the mongrel mob had begun to expand beyond its Hawke's Bay origins. The chapter system, which would become a defining feature of the gang structure, started to develop as groups in other regions adopted the mongrel mob name and affiliated with the original Hawke's Bay members. Wellington, where Maori populations in suburbs such as Porirua and the Hutt Valley faced similar social conditions to those in Hawke's Bay, saw the establishment of mongrel mob chapters in the late 1960s. The Waikato region, with its significant Maori population in Hamilton and surrounding towns, also saw mongrel mob chapters form during this period. This expansion was facilitated by several factors. Members who relocated from Hawke's Bay to other regions for employment or to stay with relatives would establish connections with local youth who were attracted to the gang's reputation and culture. The visibility of patched mongrel mob members who wore their colors openly in public served as both advertisement and recruitment tool. Young men seeking identity, belonging, and protection from rival groups were drawn to an organization that offered all three, along with a clear identity as outcasts and rebels against mainstream society. The adoption of the patch system, borrowed from motorcycle gang culture, was a significant development in the gang's evolution. Patches were earned rather than simply assumed, with prospective members required to prove their loyalty and toughness through a prospect period during which they performed tasks for full members and participated in gang activities. The granting of a patch in a formal ceremony marked acceptance into the gang and conferred both status and obligations. Patched members were expected to wear their colors openly, to respond to challenges against the gang's reputation, and to support other members in conflicts. Conflicts with other street gangs and youth groups were frequent and often brutal during this period. Fights would break out at pubs, at sporting events, or when members from rival groups encountered each other on the street. Weapons were increasingly common in these confrontations, progressing from fists and improvised implements to knives, clubs, and occasionally firearms. The willingness to engage in extreme violence became a core element of mongrel mob identity. with members expected to demonstrate that they would not back down from any confrontation regardless of the odds or consequences. Police responses to the emerging mongrel mob during this period were hampered by limited resources and understanding. The gang represented a new phenomenon in New Zealand, and law enforcement agencies were unprepared for organized groups that openly proclaimed their criminal identity through patches and colors. Individual members were arrested for specific offenses, but the gang as an organization was not initially targeted in any systematic way. This allowed the mongrel mob to consolidate and expand relatively unhindered through the late 1960s and early 1970s. By the early 1970s, the mongrel mob had established itself as a significant presence in multiple regions across the North Island, with chapters operating from Hawke's Bay to Wellington and attracting members from predominantly Maori working-class backgrounds. The emergence of the mongrel mob did not occur in isolation, as other gangs were simultaneously forming in different parts of the country during the same period. In the Wellington region and Wairarapa in the late 1960s, another gang was forming that would become the mongrel mob's most enduring rival, taking inspiration from the American Black Power movement and adopting its name and iconography. Black Power emerged in Wellington and the nearby Wairarapa district at approximately the same time that the mongrel mob was consolidating in Hawke's Bay, though the two organizations developed independently in their early stages. The Wellington region had experienced significant Maori urbanization in the post-war decades, with large populations settling in the industrial suburbs of the Hutt Valley and in Porirua, a satellite city north of Wellington that became predominantly Maori and Pacific Islander. These communities faced the same social conditions that had given rise to the mongrel mob elsewhere, including overcrowded housing, high unemployment, educational underachievement, and systematic discrimination. What distinguished Black Power from the mongrel mob in its origins was the explicit influence of American political movements. The late 1960s was the height of the Black Power movement in the United States, with organizations such as the Black Panther Party gaining international attention through their rhetoric of Black pride, self-determination, and armed resistance to oppression. News coverage of urban uprisings in American cities, the speeches of leaders such as Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and Huey Newton, and the dramatic images of Black Panthers in leather jackets and berets carrying firearms resonated powerfully with young Maori experiencing their own marginalization. The founding members of Black Power consciously adopted the American movement's symbolism and rhetoric, seeing parallels between the African American experience of racism and oppression and their own position as indigenous people colonized and marginalized in their own land. The clenched fist salute, the central symbol of the American Black Power movement, became Black Power New Zealand's primary emblem, appearing on patches worn by members. The gang's colours were established as blue, creating an immediate visual distinction from the mongrel mob's red. In its earliest incarnation, Black Power incorporated elements of political consciousness alongside the street gang culture of violence and territorial control. Some founding members genuinely saw the organization as a vehicle for Maori empowerment and resistance to racism, drawing on the rhetoric of indigenous rights and anti-colonialism. Meetings sometimes included discussions of Maori history, grievances against the Crown, and the need for Maori solidarity and self-determination. This political dimension, however limited and superficial it may have been, distinguished Black Power from the mongrel mob, which had no comparable ideological component and was defined purely by street gang culture. The reality of Black Power operations quickly diverged from any political aspirations. Like the mongrel mob, Black Power members were predominantly young Maori men from impoverished backgrounds with limited education and poor employment prospects. The gang provided identity, belonging, and status through exactly the same means as its rival, namely violence, intimidation, and criminal activity. Street fighting, theft, burglary, and other petty crimes were endemic among members, and alcohol-fueled violence was a regular feature of gang life. The adoption of American Black Power imagery and rhetoric served multiple purposes beyond any genuine political consciousness. It provided a ready-made identity and set of symbols that carried connotations of resistance and power. It offered a framework for understanding their own marginalization by connecting it to global struggles against racism and oppression. It also served to distinguish Black Power from the mongrel mob and other emerging gangs, creating a unique identity that could attract recruits who were drawn to the political associations, even if the reality was predominantly criminal. The rivalry between Black Power and the mongrel mob began almost immediately as the two gangs came into contact. The reasons for the conflict were multiple and reinforcing. At the most basic level, both gangs drew their membership from the same pool of marginalized young Maori men and competed for recruits, status, and territorial control. The adoption of different colors and symbols created tribal identities that demanded loyalty and hostility toward the other. Specific incidents of violence between members generated cycles of retaliation that became self-perpetuating. Early conflicts between the two gangs occurred in Wellington and the Wairarapa, where their territories overlapped. Confrontations at pubs, parties, and on the street escalated from individual fights to organized group violence as members rallied to support their gang's reputation. These encounters were often extremely brutal, with both sides demonstrating willingness to inflict serious injury on opponents. The violence served multiple functions within gang culture, establishing individual members' toughness and commitment, reinforcing group solidarity through shared combat, and maintaining each gang's reputation for fearlessness. Territorial divisions began to solidify as the rivalry intensified. Certain suburbs, streets, and pubs became understood as mongrel mob or Black Power territory, with members of rival gangs entering such areas at considerable risk. These boundaries were enforced through violence and the threat of violence, creating de facto zones of control throughout Wellington and other cities where both gangs operated. The territorial divisions often overlapped with existing neighborhood and kinship networks, as extended families and local communities tended to affiliate predominantly with one gang or the other. The gang structure that developed within Black Power paralleled that of the mongrel mob in many respects. A prospect system required potential members to prove their loyalty and toughness before being granted full membership and the right to wear the patch. Chapters formed in different areas, each with local leadership, but connected through shared identity and mutual support obligations. Hierarchies emerged based on fighting prowess, length of membership, and willingness to commit violence on behalf of the gang. Black Power's expansion pattern differed somewhat from the mongrel mob's, reflecting its Wellington origins. The gang spread through the lower North Island, establishing strong presences in the Wairarapa towns of Masterton and Carterton, and in various Wellington suburbs. Expansion into other regions occurred more slowly than the mongrel mob's rapid growth, with Black Power remaining more concentrated in its core areas through the early 1970s. This geographical concentration, however, allowed the gang to establish deep roots in specific communities where it became a dominant presence. The relationship between Black Power and the communities in which it operated was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, patched gang members were sources of fear and intimidation, their presence associated with violence and criminal activity. On the other hand, many members maintained connections to their families and local neighborhoods, and the gang provided a form of social structure and support network for its members, however dysfunctional. Some community members, particularly family members of gang members, defended the gangs as products of social deprivation and racism rather than inherently criminal organizations. By the mid-1970s, both Black Power and the mongrel mob had become fixtures in certain New Zealand communities, particularly in working-class suburbs with high Maori populations. The hostility between them had solidified into an enduring rivalry that would shape both organizations for decades to come. Members identified themselves as fundamentally opposed to the rival gang, with allegiance to one precluding any association with the other. This binary division of gang loyalty created a situation where young men in affected communities often faced pressure to choose sides or risk being targeted by both gangs as unaffiliated and therefore vulnerable. The rivalry between the mongrel mob and Black Power, which began in the early 1970s, would continue in varying levels of intensity for the next 5 decades and define much of New Zealand's gang landscape. As these two homegrown gangs were establishing themselves, New Zealand was also about to see the arrival of international motorcycle clubs that would further complicate the criminal landscape. New Zealand's gang environment became increasingly complex in the 1970s with the arrival of international outlaw motorcycle clubs, principally the Hells Angels, which established its first chapter in Auckland in 1961, though the club's prominence would not be felt until later decades. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club had its origins in California in the late 1940s and had by the 1960s become the most infamous outlaw motorcycle gang in the world, with chapters spreading across the United States and internationally. The organization's reputation was built on a deliberate rejection of mainstream society, a strict hierarchical structure, and involvement in various forms of organized crime. When the first Hells Angels chapter was established in Auckland in 1961, it represented the importation of a fully formed gang model with established traditions, symbols, and operational practices. The early years of the Hells Angels in New Zealand saw limited growth and relatively low visibility. The organization remained confined largely to Auckland and attracted a different demographic than the emerging street gangs, while the mongrel mob and Black Power drew their membership almost exclusively from young Maori men in impoverished urban communities. The Hells Angels initially attracted predominantly Pākehā members from working class and lower middle class backgrounds who were drawn to motorcycle culture and the outlaw biker aesthetic. Membership required ownership of motorcycle, typically a Harley-Davidson or other large displacement machine, which represented a significant financial barrier that excluded the poorest youth who were joining street gangs. The organizational structure of outlaw motorcycle clubs differed substantially from that of street gangs. The Hells Angels operated according to a formal hierarchy with defined roles and titles. Each chapter had a president who held ultimate authority within that chapter, a vice president, a secretary-treasurer, a sergeant-at-arms responsible for discipline and security, and a road captain who organized rides and runs. Members progressed through clearly defined stages from hang-around to prospect to full patch-holding member, with each stage involving specific obligations and privileges. Written bylaws governed member behavior, and violation of club rules could result in fines, loss of patches, physical punishment, or expulsion. This level of organizational sophistication was absent from the street gangs of the period, which operated with more informal leadership structures based primarily on personal dominance and fighting ability. The motorcycle club model provided a framework for coordinating criminal activities more systematically than street gangs were capable of in their early years, though it would take time before the Hells Angels in New Zealand fully exploited this organizational advantage. The Hells Angels' criminal activities centered on drug trafficking, prostitution, extortion, and the control of legitimate businesses that could be used for money laundering. Unlike street gangs, which were primarily engaged in petty crime and street violence, motorcycle clubs focused on profit-generating enterprises that required planning, organization, and business acumen. The manufacture and distribution of methamphetamine would later become a major source of income, though in the 1960s and 1970s, the drug trade focused more on cannabis and later on harder drugs such as cocaine and heroin. Relationships between the Hells Angels and the emerging street gangs were complex and varied. In some cases, the organizations coexisted with minimal interaction, operating in different geographic areas and targeting different criminal markets. The motorcycle club's concentration in urban centers, particularly Auckland, and their focus on organized crime enterprises meant that they did not necessarily compete directly with street gangs for territory or membership. However, conflicts did arise when interests overlapped, particularly around drug distribution networks and protection rackets. The arrival of other outlaw motorcycle clubs added further complexity to New Zealand's gang landscape. Highway 61, a New Zealand-originated motorcycle club, was formed in the late 1960s and quickly established itself as a significant presence in Auckland and other cities. The club adopted many of the organizational practices and cultural elements of international motorcycle gangs while developing its own distinct identity and territorial claims. Conflicts between Highway 61 and the Hells Angels were frequent in the early years, often centered on questions of status, territory, and criminal market share. Additional motorcycle clubs, including the Road Knights, Mothers MC, and various smaller organizations, appeared through the 1970s and 1980s. Some of these were short-lived, while others established lasting presences in specific cities or regions. The proliferation of motorcycle clubs created a complex network of alliances and rivalries that operated largely independently of the street gang conflicts between the mongrel mob and Black Power, though occasional interactions and conflicts did occur when members of different gang types encountered each other. The geographic distribution of motorcycle clubs reflected their different origins and membership base. Auckland, as New Zealand's largest city and economic centre, became the primary hub for outlaw motorcycle club activity, with multiple clubs establishing chapters there and competing for dominance. Wellington and Christchurch also saw motorcycle club chapters form, though on a smaller scale than Auckland. The club's urban focus contrasted with street gangs' presence in both cities and smaller provincial towns, reflecting the different social bases and operational models of the two types of organizations. Membership demographics highlighted the class and ethnic differences between motorcycle clubs and street gangs. While street gangs were overwhelmingly Maori and increasingly Pacific Islander, with members drawn from the most economically disadvantaged communities, motorcycle clubs attracted a broader ethnic mix, with a higher proportion of Pākehā members and individuals with somewhat more stable economic backgrounds. The requirement to own and maintain an expensive motorcycle, to pay chapter dues, and to invest in club colours and related equipment created financial barriers that effectively excluded the poorest potential members. Police responses to outlaw motorcycle clubs differed from their approach to street gangs in significant ways. Motorcycle clubs' more sophisticated criminal operations and their international connections made them targets for organized crime investigations that street gangs did not initially attract. Surveillance, undercover operations, and prosecutions under organized crime statutes were deployed against motorcycle clubs earlier and more systematically than against street gangs. However, the club's organizational discipline and members' adherence to codes of silence made successful prosecutions difficult, and the clubs continued to operate and expand despite law enforcement attention. The cultural impact of outlaw motorcycle clubs extended beyond their direct membership. The biker aesthetic of leather jackets, motorcycles, and club colors influenced broader youth culture and became part of the imagery of rebellion and outlawry. Films, magazines, and news coverage of motorcycle gangs created a mystique that attracted young men seeking identity and belonging outside mainstream society. This cultural influence operated alongside but separately from the street gang culture that was developing in Maori and Pacific Islander communities. The arrival of outlaw motorcycle clubs added another dimension to New Zealand's gang landscape, creating a three-tiered system of street gangs, motorcycle clubs, and emerging ethnic gangs, each with their own territorial claims and criminal enterprises. As the number and variety of gangs expanded through the 1970s, their activities began to evolve from street violence and petty crime toward more organized and lucrative criminal enterprises. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, New Zealand's gangs were transitioning from loose associations focused on street fighting and territorial disputes into more structured organizations engaged in systematic criminal enterprises. The evolution of gang activity from violence-centered street culture to profit-driven criminal operations occurred gradually over more than a decade and reflected broader changes in both the gangs themselves and the opportunities available to them. The initial phase of gang development in the 1960s and early 1970s had been characterized by a primary focus on fighting, territorial control, and the establishment of gang identity and reputation through violence. Criminal activity during this period consisted largely of opportunistic petty crime, with individual members or small groups engaging in theft, burglary, and receiving stolen goods to support themselves, but without systematic organization or coordination at the gang level. The cannabis trade provided the first major opportunity for gangs to generate substantial income through organized criminal activity. New Zealand had developed a significant domestic cannabis market by the 1970s, with demand increasing steadily among both recreational users and more regular consumers. The country's climate, particularly in the northern regions, proved suitable for outdoor cultivation of cannabis plants, and many rural areas with limited law enforcement presence became sites for large-scale growing operations. Gangs, with their existing networks of members across different regions and their willingness to use violence to protect their interests, were well positioned to exploit this market. The mongrel mob and Black Power both became heavily involved in cannabis cultivation and distribution during the 1970s and 1980s. Rural chapters or members with access to farmland established growing operations that produced substantial quantities of cannabis, which was then distributed through urban networks controlled by gang members. The profits from cannabis trafficking were significant by comparison to the proceeds of petty crime, and provided gangs with financial resources that could be used to expand operations, acquire vehicles and properties, and support members. Violence associated with the cannabis trade took several forms. Rival gangs, competing for market share, engaged in conflicts over distribution territories and supply sources. Cannabis plantations required protection from theft by other criminals, leading to armed guards and sometimes violent confrontations when grows were raided. Law enforcement efforts to locate and destroy cannabis crops resulted in standoffs and occasional violence when police encountered growers. The willingness of gang members to use violence to protect their cannabis operations made the trade more dangerous than it would otherwise have been, and contributed to an escalation in gang-related violence through the 1980s. The arrival of methamphetamine in New Zealand in the 1990s transformed gang operations and economics more dramatically than any previous development. Methamphetamine, known locally as P or ice, was a far more profitable drug than cannabis due to its higher price per unit, more addictive nature creating repeat customers, and more compact form making distribution easier. The drug was initially imported from Asian sources, but by the late 1990s and early 2000s, local manufacture had begun on a significant scale, with gang members establishing clandestine laboratories to produce methamphetamine from imported precursor chemicals. The methamphetamine trade generated unprecedented profits for gangs. Where cannabis operations might earn thousands of dollars, methamphetamine manufacturing and distribution could generate hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars for successful operations. This level of income allowed gangs to expand their operations, acquire sophisticated equipment and communications technology, and pay members regular incomes rather than relying on sporadic proceeds from opportunistic crime. The transformation of gangs into organizations resembling criminal businesses rather than street fighting clubs can be traced largely to the methamphetamine economy. Manufacturing methamphetamine required technical knowledge, access to chemical precursors, laboratory equipment, and secure locations for production. Gangs developed networks to acquire these necessities, often through connections with Asian organized crime syndicates that supplied precursor chemicals and technical expertise. Clandestine laboratories were established in rural properties, suburban houses, and commercial buildings, with gang members either operating the labs themselves or employing chemists to produce the drug under gang protection and control. Distribution networks for methamphetamine utilized gang structures and territories. Street-level dealing was often conducted by lower-ranking members or associates, with proceeds flowing up through gang hierarchies to those controlling supply. Violence was used to enforce market control, punish dealers who withheld money or product, and eliminate competitors. The high value of methamphetamine and the large sums of money involved made the trade far more violent than cannabis distribution had been, as the stakes were proportionally higher and the incentives for robbery, fraud, and betrayal were greater. Prison populations became increasingly important to gang operations during this period, as more gang members were incarcerated for drug offences and violent crimes. The gangs established strong presences within New Zealand prisons. Prison chapters operated with their own hierarchies and enforced gang rules and allegiances within the prison environment. Prisons became recruitment grounds where young offenders were inducted into gangs, and sites where gang business was planned and coordinated. The ability to maintain operations and command structures across prison walls demonstrated the increasing sophistication of gang organizations. Money laundering became necessary as gangs accumulated substantial cash proceeds from drug trafficking. Various methods were employed to legitimize drug money, including investment in legitimate businesses such as car yards, bars, and other cash-intensive operations, purchase of real estate under the names of associates or family members who were not gang members, and movement of cash through complex networks of transactions designed to obscure its origins. Some gangs developed considerable sophistication in money laundering, employing accountants and financial advisors to structure their operations. The expansion of criminal enterprises led to growth in gang membership numbers, where the mongrel mob and Black Power had numbered their members in the hundreds through the 1970s. By the 1990s, both organizations had grown to several thousand members each. New chapters were established in towns and cities throughout New Zealand, extending gang presence into areas that had previously had limited gang activity. The prospect of earning significant income from drug distribution, combined with the traditional attractions of identity and belonging, made gang membership appealing to young men in marginalized communities. Relationships between gangs and the communities in which they operated became more strained as drug dealing became prevalent. While earlier gang activities had been primarily internal to gang culture or directed at rival gangs, methamphetamine dealing affected entire neighborhoods as users became addicted and local crime rates increased. The social harm caused by widespread methamphetamine addiction generated greater public opposition to gangs and increased pressure on law enforcement to take action against them. By the turn of the millennium, New Zealand's gangs had evolved into sophisticated criminal organizations, generating millions of dollars annually through drug trafficking and other enterprises, while maintaining their street presence and territorial conflicts. The increasing wealth from criminal enterprises, particularly methamphetamine, led to an escalation in both the scale and violence of gang conflicts in the 2000s. The arrival and rapid proliferation of methamphetamine in New Zealand in the early 2000s transform the country's criminal landscape and dramatically increase both the profits available to gangs and the violence associated with the drug trade. Methamphetamine had existed in New Zealand in small quantities since the 1990s, initially imported by Asian organized crime syndicates and distributed through their own networks with limited gang involvement. The drug, a powerful central nervous system stimulant that produced intense euphoria and increased energy, followed by severe crashes and highly addictive cravings, had devastated communities in parts of Asia, Australia, and the United States before gaining significant traction in New Zealand. However, by the early 2000s, methamphetamine use had begun to spread rapidly through New Zealand's drug-using population, creating a large and growing market that gangs moved quickly to exploit. The economics of methamphetamine made it far more attractive to criminal organizations than cannabis had been. Where a kilogram of cannabis might sell for several $1,000s, a kilogram of methamphetamine could fetch prices of $200,000 or more at wholesale level, with even higher profit margins at retail. A single point, 1/10 of a gram, typically sold for $100 on the street, meaning that a single gram could generate $1,000 in revenue. The drug's highly addictive nature ensured repeat customers and steady demand, while its compact size made it easier to transport and conceal than bulky cannabis shipments. Manufacturing methamphetamine required precursor chemicals, particularly pseudoephedrine and ephedrine, which were controlled substances but could be obtained through various means. Pharmaceutical products containing these chemicals were purchased in bulk from retail outlets, stolen from warehouses, or imported illegally. Asian organized crime syndicates, particularly Chinese triads, developed sophisticated supply chains to provide precursor chemicals to New Zealand manufacturers, often smuggling them in shipping containers alongside legitimate cargo or through corrupt officials at ports of entry. Clandestine laboratories for methamphetamine production proliferated across New Zealand through the 2000s and 2010s. Police discovered laboratories in suburban houses in cities such as Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, and Christchurch, in rural farmhouses and outbuildings, in isolated areas where the distinctive chemical smells would not attract attention, and in commercial or industrial premises rented or purchased specifically for manufacturing purposes. The production process was dangerous, with risks of explosion, fire, and toxic chemical exposure, but the enormous profits made such risks acceptable to those operating the labs. Gang members were involved in methamphetamine manufacturing at various levels. Some gangs employed chemists or cooks, individuals with sufficient knowledge to conduct the manufacturing process, under gang protection and direction. Other gang members operated laboratories themselves after learning the production techniques through trial and error or instruction from more experienced manufacturers. The gang's role was to provide security for the operation, ensure supply of precursor chemicals, and control distribution of the finished product through their established networks. The scale of methamphetamine manufacturing in New Zealand grew rapidly through the 2000s. In 2000, police discovered fewer than 10 clandestine laboratories nationwide. By 2005, this number had increased to over 200 laboratories discovered and dismantled annually, though law enforcement estimates suggested that this represented only a fraction of actual manufacturing operations. At the peak of the domestic manufacturing boom in the late 2000s, hundreds of laboratories were operating simultaneously across the country, producing hundreds of kilograms of methamphetamine annually. Distribution of methamphetamine followed established gang structures and territorial divisions. Major gangs controlled supply at the wholesale level, acquiring large quantities from manufacturers or importers and distributing it through their chapter networks. Street-level dealers, often gang prospects or associates rather than fully patched members, sold directly to users in the communities where gangs operated. The Mongrel Mob, Black Power, and various outlaw motorcycle clubs all became heavily involved in the methamphetamine trade, generating income that dwarfed anything they had previously earned from cannabis or other criminal activities. Violence associated with the methamphetamine trade exceeded anything New Zealand had previously experienced in relation to drug trafficking. The high value of the drug and the large sums of money involved created strong incentives for robbery and theft from rival dealers. Home invasions targeting drug dealers became common, often characterized by extreme violence as perpetrators tortured victims to reveal the location of hidden drugs or money. Murders related to methamphetamine debts, territory disputes, or retribution for perceived betrayals increased substantially through the 2000s and 2010s. Turf wars between gangs intensified as the methamphetamine market expanded and the potential profits increased. Areas that had previously seen only occasional violence erupted into sustained conflicts as gangs fought for control of distribution territories. Drive-by shootings, previously rare in New Zealand, became more frequent as gang members armed with firearms attacked rival gang members or their properties. Public spaces, including shopping centres, bars, and residential streets, became sites of gang violence, with innocent bystanders occasionally caught in the crossfire. The public health crisis created by widespread methamphetamine use affected communities throughout New Zealand. Users often experienced severe psychological effects, including paranoia, hallucinations, and violent behavior, while the physical health consequences of chronic use included dental decay, skin sores, rapid weight loss, and cardiovascular damage. Children in households where parents were methamphetamine users or dealers faced neglect, abuse, and exposure to dangerous environments. Emergency departments, mental health services, and social welfare agencies were overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. Communities in areas with heavy gang presence experienced the methamphetamine crisis most acutely. South Auckland suburbs such as Otara, Mangere, and Manurewa saw methamphetamine addiction affect thousands of residents, with associated increases in property crime, family violence, and social dysfunction. Similar patterns emerged in Porirua, parts of Wellington and the Hutt Valley, the Waikato region, Hawke's Bay, and various provincial towns. The concentration of methamphetamine problems in predominantly Maori and Pacific Islander communities meant that these populations bore a disproportionate burden of the drug's social harm. Law enforcement responses to the methamphetamine crisis expanded significantly through the 2000s and 2010s. Police established specialized units focused on methamphetamine manufacture and distribution, including the Organized Crime Agency and various regional drug squads. Operations targeting clandestine laboratories resulted in numerous arrests and seizures of manufacturing equipment, precursor chemicals, and finished product. Major investigations into gang-controlled distribution networks led to prosecutions of senior gang members under organized crime legislation. Operation Austin, launched in the mid-2000s, targeted the supply of precursor chemicals by restricting over-the-counter sales of pseudoephedrine-containing cold medications and increasing monitoring of bulk pharmaceutical purchases. The operation successfully reduced domestic methamphetamine manufacture by limiting access to essential precursor chemicals, though it also had the unintended consequence of increasing importation of finished methamphetamine from Asian sources. Legislative changes aimed at disrupting gang operations and methamphetamine trafficking included amendments to proceeds of crime legislation, allowing authorities to seize assets derived from drug dealing, enhance penalties for methamphetamine manufacture and distribution, and provisions allowing police to charge individuals with participation in organized criminal groups. These measures provided law enforcement with additional tools to target gangs and their criminal enterprises, though their effectiveness remained limited by the challenges of gathering evidence and securing convictions. The methamphetamine trade facilitated gang expansion into smaller towns and rural areas that had previously had limited gang presence. Provincial centres such as Whangarei, Gisborne, Wanganui, New Plymouth, and numerous smaller towns saw gang chapters establish themselves or existing small groups affiliate with major gangs. The motivation was partly to exploit new markets for methamphetamine distribution in areas with less competition and police scrutiny than major cities, and partly to access rural properties suitable for clandestine laboratories away from concentrated populations. Internal gang dynamics shifted as the methamphetamine trade generated both enormous profits and new tensions within gang organizations. Younger members who were more willing to engage in the risks associated with methamphetamine dealing and more comfortable with the violence required to protect market share, sometimes challenged older leadership structures. Disputes over money, with allegations of senior members taking disproportionate shares of profits or misappropriating gang funds, created fractures within gangs, and sometimes led to breakaway factions forming new chapters or even new gangs. The traditional hierarchy and structure of gangs faced pressures from the different demands of operating profitable criminal enterprises. Business acumen, connections to suppliers, and ability to manage distribution networks became as important as fighting prowess and gang loyalty in determining influence within organizations. Some gangs adapted by developing more sophisticated management structures, while others experienced internal conflicts between those who saw the gang primarily as a criminal business and those who maintained focus on the traditional gang culture of brotherhood and territory. Competition from newer gangs, unencumbered by traditional rivalries and structures, also challenged the dominance of the mongrel mob and black power in the methamphetamine trade. Organizations such as the Headhunters and Killer Bees, which emerged or gained prominence in the methamphetamine era, often proved more adaptable and ruthless in pursuing profits. These groups adopted more business-like approaches to drug trafficking, forming alliances across traditional gang boundaries when profitable and showing less attachment to the street gang culture that still shaped the older organizations. By the 2010s, methamphetamine had become the dominant drug in New Zealand's criminal economy, generating unprecedented profits for the gangs while contributing to increased violence, social harm, and a public health emergency that would prompt significant law enforcement and policy responses. The methamphetamine trade also contributed to the emergence of a new generation of gangs, particularly in Auckland, that would challenge the dominance of the traditional organizations. While the mongrel mob and Black Power remained the largest gangs by membership, the 1990s and 2000s saw the emergence of new organizations that adopted more business-like approaches to criminal enterprise and attracted different demographics. The Headhunters Motorcycle Club was formed in Auckland in the early 1970s, but remained a relatively small organization for its first 2 decades, operating in the shadow of larger gangs and focusing primarily on motorcycle club culture and localized criminal activity. The gang's transformation into one of New Zealand's most powerful criminal organizations occurred in the 1990s under the leadership of Wayne Doyle, who restructured the Headhunters along more corporate lines with an explicit focus on generating profit through organized crime rather than traditional gang activities of street fighting and territorial displays. Doyle, who became president of the Headhunters in the late 1980s, recognized that the gang's future lay in systematic exploitation of criminal opportunities rather than in perpetuating the often self-destructive patterns of older gangs. Under his leadership, the Headhunters developed sophisticated drug distribution networks, established connections with international suppliers, and implemented organizational structures that prioritized efficiency and profit over the traditional gang culture of visible patches and public violence. Members were expected to conduct themselves in ways that minimized police attention and maximized earning potential, a significant departure from the confrontational public presence that characterized the mongrel mob and Black Power. The Headhunters' organizational model proved highly successful in the methamphetamine era. The gang established control over significant portions of Auckland's drug distribution network, generated millions of dollars annually from methamphetamine sales, and expanded operations throughout the North Island. Membership grew to several hundred patched members, supported by networks of prospects and associates who handled street-level distribution and other lower-risk activities. The gang's relative discipline and business focus made it formidable competition for the older, larger gangs that often suffered from internal conflicts and less coherent operational strategies. The Killer Bees emerged in South Auckland in the late 1990s and early 2000s as a predominantly Pacific Islander gang, reflecting the changing demographics of areas such as Otara and Mangere, where Samoan, Tongan, and other Pacific populations had grown substantially. The gang was formed initially as a youth group by teenagers and young men in Otara who felt marginalized both by mainstream society and by the predominantly Maori membership of established gangs. The name Killer Bees referenced both the aggressive image the gang sought to project and the connection to Otara, where the bee is a symbol of the suburb. Unlike the mongrel mob and Black Power, which had developed over decades from street fighting origins into criminal enterprises, the Killer Bees emerged directly into the methamphetamine economy and structured themselves around drug distribution from their inception. The gang adopted a cell-based structure with different groups controlling specific areas and operations, coordinated through leadership but operating with considerable autonomy. This organizational model proved effective for drug distribution, while making the gang more difficult for police to disrupt, as arrests of members from one cell did not necessarily compromise other operations. The Killer Bees grew rapidly through the 2000s to become one of the dominant gangs in South Auckland, with membership estimated in the hundreds and extensive involvement in methamphetamine distribution, violence, and other criminal activities. Conflicts with rival gangs, including established organizations and other newer groups, resulted in numerous violent incidents, including shootings, assaults, and property destruction. The gang's predominantly Pacific Islander membership and its territorial base in South Auckland made it a significant force in areas where older gangs had previously dominated. The Tribesmen Motorcycle Club was formed in the South Island, initially in Christchurch, and represented the emergence of a significant gang organisation outside the traditional North Island strongholds of gang activity. The club adopted the outlaw motorcycle gang model with formal hierarchies, prospect systems, and an emphasis on motorcycle culture. But like other gangs of its generation, it focused heavily on drug trafficking and other profit-generating crime, rather than the recreational riding and brotherhood aspects that had characterized earlier motorcycle clubs. Tribesmen expanded through the South Island and eventually into the North Island, establishing chapters in various cities and towns and engaging in conflicts with both established motorcycle clubs and street gangs. The gang's growth in areas that had previously had limited gang presence demonstrated the expansion of gang culture throughout New Zealand by the 2000s, as even relatively isolated communities began to experience the establishment of gang chapters and associated criminal activity and violence. The King Cobras, like the Killer Bees, emerged as a predominantly Pacific Islander gang in Auckland during the 1990s and 2000s. Various smaller gangs formed in different regions during this period as well, some remaining localized and eventually disbanding or being absorbed by larger organizations, others establishing themselves as enduring presences in specific communities. The proliferation of gangs reflected both the attraction of gang membership for marginalized youth and the profitability of the drug trade that provided financial incentive for new organizations to form and compete for market share. Ethnic diversity increased within New Zealand's gang landscape during this period, while the mongrel mob and Black Power remained predominantly Maori. The newer gangs included substantial Pacific Islander membership, and some outlaw motorcycle clubs had increasingly diverse membership, including Pākehā, Maori, Pacific Islanders, and occasionally members of Asian backgrounds. This ethnic diversification reflected both the changing demographics of the communities where gangs operated and a pragmatic focus on criminal competence and profit generation over traditional ethnic and cultural affiliations. The newer gangs adopted different relationships with gang culture and identity than the older organizations, while the mongrel mob and Black Power maintained strong emphasis on visible display of patches and colors, public demonstrations of gang presence, and adherence to gang protocols and traditions. Some newer gangs took more flexible approaches. The headhunters under Doyle's leadership discouraged members from wearing patches in situations that might attract police attention, prioritizing operational security over public display. Other newer gangs adopted similar pragmatic stances, wearing colors when useful for intimidation or group identity, but removing them when conducting criminal business that required discretion. Internal structures varied among the newer gangs as well. Some adopted formal hierarchies with defined ranks and roles, while others operated with more fluid leadership arrangements based on control of specific operations or territories. The diversity of organizational models reflected the different origins and operational focuses of the various gangs, with some prioritizing tight control and others allowing greater autonomy to chapters or cells. What united the newer gangs was a general emphasis on profit generation and criminal enterprise as primary purposes, rather than the street gang culture of territory and fighting that had motivated the original gang formations. Conflicts between newer gangs and established organizations added further complexity to an already violent gang landscape. The Headhunters' expansion in Auckland brought them into conflict with existing gangs controlling drug distribution territories, resulting in violent confrontations and ongoing tensions. The Killer Bees faced opposition from both mongrel mob and Black Power chapters in South Auckland, as well as conflicts with other emerging Pacific Islander gangs. These conflicts layered additional violence onto the existing mongrel mob and Black Power rivalry that continued unabated through this period. These newer gangs represented an evolution in New Zealand's criminal landscape, combining the territorial presence of traditional street gangs with the organizational sophistication of outlaw motorcycle clubs and a ruthless focus on profit maximization. The proliferation of gangs and the escalation of violence associated with the methamphetamine trade had a profound impact on specific communities throughout New Zealand, particularly in urban centres and smaller provincial towns. By the 2000s and 2010s, gang activity had transformed certain communities throughout New Zealand, with areas such as South Auckland, Porirua, the Waikato region, and Hawke's Bay experiencing levels of violence and intimidation that affected daily life for thousands of residents. South Auckland bore the most concentrated impact of gang activity. Suburbs including Otara, Mangere, Manurewa, and Otahuhu had gang populations numbering in the thousands, with multiple gangs operating in overlapping territories. Visible displays of gang presence were constant, with patched members congregating in public spaces, gang colours worn openly on streets, and gang graffiti marking territorial boundaries on walls and buildings throughout these areas. Residents reported feeling unsafe in their own neighbourhoods, with gang members often gathering outside shops, at bus stops, and in parks where their presence intimidated local people going about ordinary activities. Violent statistics in South Auckland reflected the intensity of gang activity. In 2010, police recorded over 800 violent offences with identified gang connections in the county's Manukau district, which encompasses South Auckland, representing approximately 15 violent gang-related incidents per week. These figures included assaults, home invasions, shootings, and other violent crimes directly attributable to gang members or gang conflicts. The actual number was likely higher, as many incidents went unreported due to victim fear of retaliation or community reluctance to cooperate with police. Porirua, a city north of Wellington with a population of approximately 55,000, experienced similar patterns of gang saturation and associated violence. The suburbs of Cannons Creek and Waitangirua had particularly heavy gang presence, with both the mongrel mob and Black Power maintaining strong chapters in the area alongside other gangs. Conflicts between rival gangs resulted in regular violent incidents, while the visibility of gang members in everyday community spaces created an atmosphere of tension and fear. Local businesses reported being targeted for intimidation and extortion, with gang members demanding money or goods under threat of violence or property damage. The Waikato region, centered on the city of Hamilton, saw sustained gang activity through the 2000s and 2010s, with multiple gangs operating in the city and surrounding towns, including Huntly, Ngaruawahia, and Te Awamutu. Hamilton recorded over 500 gang-related violent offences in 2012 alone, an average of more than 9 per week in a city with a population of approximately 160,000. Gang presence in Hamilton was particularly visible in certain suburbs where patched members routinely congregated and where gang colours and symbols were displayed openly. Smaller towns in the Waikato experienced disproportionate impacts from gang activity, given their limited populations and resources, with a single gang chapter in a town of several thousand residents having far more influence over community life than would be the case in a larger city. Hawke's Bay, the birthplace of the mongrel mob, continued to experience heavy gang presence and violence decades after the gang's formation. Hastings and Napier, with a combined population of approximately 130,000, recorded hundreds of gang-related violent incidents annually through the 2010s. The concentration of gang activity in specific neighborhoods created zones where gang culture dominated social life and where children grew up surrounded by gang presence and symbolism. Schools in areas with heavy gang concentration faced challenges as students from gang-affiliated families interacted with peers from rival gang backgrounds, sometimes bringing gang conflicts into the school environment. The impact on children in gang-affected communities was particularly severe. Children growing up in households where parents or older siblings were gang members were exposed to violence, drug use, and criminal activity as normal aspects of daily life. Schools in areas such as Otara, Cannons Creek, and parts of Hamilton reported incidents of young children wearing gang colours or displaying gang symbols, indicating early identification with gang culture. Teachers and social workers documented cases of children as young as 8 or 9 being recruited as prospects or associates for gangs, running errands, carrying messages, or participating in minor criminal activities. Educational outcomes in areas with heavy gang presence were significantly worse than national averages. Truancy rates were higher, with some students avoiding school due to fear of encountering rival gang members or being targeted for recruitment or intimidation. Schools struggled to provide safe learning environments when gang conflicts extended into school grounds and when significant portions of the student population had direct connections to gang members. The normalization of gang culture made it difficult for educators to present alternative pathways to students who saw gang membership as an inevitable part of their future. Economic effects of gang activity damaged communities beyond the direct violence and intimidation. Property values in suburbs with heavy gang presence were lower than comparable areas without such activity, trapping residents in declining neighborhoods. Businesses faced challenges operating in gang-affected areas, with some closing due to theft, vandalism, or intimidation, while others struggled to attract customers who avoided areas perceived as dangerous. The concentration of economic disadvantage and gang activity created self-reinforcing cycles where poverty contributed to gang recruitment and gang presence further depressed economic conditions. Community initiatives to address gang activity faced significant obstacles. Residents who spoke out against gangs or cooperated with police risked retaliation against themselves or their families, creating cultures of silence that made it difficult to organize effective community responses. Programs aimed at providing alternatives to gang membership for youth often struggle to compete with the immediate sense of belonging, identity, and financial support that gangs offered. The intergenerational nature of gang membership in many families meant that children were effectively born into gang affiliation, making intervention efforts difficult. Police responses to gang activity in heavily affected communities involved both suppression and community engagement strategies, though resources were often inadequate to the scale of the problem. Dedicated gang units conducted investigations, arrests, and prosecutions of gang members for specific offences, while also attempting to gather intelligence about gang structures and operations. However, the large numbers of gang members, the complexity of gang networks, and the difficulties of securing witness cooperation limited the effectiveness of enforcement efforts. Police presence in gang-affected areas was increased during periods of heightened violence, though such surges were often temporary, and gang activity typically resumed once police attention shifted elsewhere. The visibility of gang activity in affected communities created situations where gang culture became normalized as simply part of the local environment. Young people grew up seeing patched gang members as permanent fixtures of their neighborhoods, gang colors as ordinary aspects of street life, and gang violence as unremarkable occurrences that generated brief attention before being absorbed into the background of community experience. This normalization made gang membership appear as a natural or inevitable choice rather than a deviant path, particularly for young men with limited alternative sources of identity, belonging, or economic opportunity. The concentration of gang activity in specific communities created environments where violence and criminal activity became normalized aspects of daily life, affecting generations of children who grew up surrounded by gang presence and often saw membership as an inevitable path. Despite the significant community impact, gangs also maintained public relations efforts similar to those pioneered by criminal organizations in other countries, attempting to portray themselves as community protectors and supporters. New Zealand's major gangs, particularly the Mongrel Mob and Black Power, have consistently attempted to cultivate public support through charitable activities, cultural events, and claims of protecting Maori and Pacific Islander communities from marginalization. Charitable activities organized by gangs became increasingly common from the 1990s onward as gang leaders recognized the value of positive public perception. Christmas toy runs, where gang members on motorcycles or in convoys of vehicles would deliver donated toys to children in impoverished communities, became annual events organized by various gangs. These events generated media coverage, showing patched gang members distributing presents to grateful families, creating images that contrasted sharply with the violence and drug dealing that characterized most gang activity. The Mongrel Mob and Black Power both organized such events in multiple cities, as did outlaw motorcycle clubs, including the Hells Angels and Headhunters. Sports programs represented another avenue for gang community engagement. several gangs established or sponsored rugby league and rugby union teams, providing equipment, uniforms, and facilities for youth in areas where organized sports programs were limited. Gang-sponsored teams competed in local leagues and tournaments, with gang members attending games and sometimes coaching or managing teams. These programs provided some young people with structured activities and positive outlets for their energy, though critics argued that they also served as recruitment pipelines for gangs to identify and groom potential future members. Cultural identity provided a central element of gang public relations efforts, particularly for the predominantly Maori mongrel mob and Black Power. Gang leaders frequently framed their organizations as products of colonization and responses to ongoing Maori marginalization, positioning themselves as protectors of Maori communities against racism and economic oppression. Some gangs incorporated Maori cultural practices, including speaking Te Reo Maori at meetings, performing haka, and referencing traditional concepts of wānau and manaakitanga to justify their existence as extensions of Maori communal values, rather than criminal organizations. Participation in political protests and social justice movements allowed gangs to present themselves as advocates for indigenous rights and social change. Gang members joined protests against government policies affecting Maori, participated in hikoi or marches to Parliament, and aligned themselves publicly with various Maori sovereignty and self-determination movements. The foreshore and seabed controversy of the early 2000s, which concerned ownership and access rights to New Zealand's coastal areas, saw significant gang participation in protests, with gang leaders speaking at rallies and patched members visible in demonstrations. Media appearances by gang leaders contributed to efforts to shape public perception. Leaders of major gangs gave interviews to newspapers, television programs, and documentary filmmakers, presenting narratives of gangs as misunderstood, organizations providing support and belonging to people abandoned by mainstream society. These interviews often emphasized the social conditions that produced gang membership, while downplaying or justifying gang violence and criminal activity as necessary responses to oppression, or as individual actions not representative of the organizations as a whole. The contrast between gang public relations activities and their ongoing criminal operations was stark. While gangs organized toy runs and sports programs, they simultaneously controlled methamphetamine distribution networks that devastated the same communities they claimed to support. Gang members who spoke of protecting Maori cultural identity were often involved in violence against other Maori, including members of rival gangs and residents of gang-affected communities who were victimized by gang criminal activity. The financial resources used for charitable activities came directly from drug trafficking and other crimes that caused immeasurable harm. Community responses to gang public relations efforts were divided. Some residents of gang-affected areas, particularly family members of gang members, defended gangs as providing support and structure in communities where government services and economic opportunities were inadequate. They pointed to instances of gangs protecting community members from external threats, providing financial assistance to families in need, and organizing events that brought communities together. These defenders often emphasized the social factors that produced gang membership and argued that gangs should be understood as symptoms of deeper social problems rather than as purely criminal organizations. Others in the same communities rejected gang narratives of community protection and cultural preservation as cynical manipulation designed to shield criminal organizations from criticism and law enforcement action. These critics pointed to the violence, intimidation, and drug dealing that gangs inflicted on their own communities, arguing that any positive activities were vastly outweighed by the harm caused. Community members who opposed gangs often did so quietly due to fear of retaliation, though some individuals who had lost family members to gang violence or drug addiction became vocal critics despite personal risks. Academic and political debates about gang motivations and social roles reflected these divergent community perspectives. Some researchers and activists emphasize structural factors, including colonization, poverty, and racism as root causes of gang formation, arguing that effective responses required addressing these underlying conditions rather than simply suppressing gangs through law enforcement. Others focused on gang violence and criminality as choices made by individuals who victimize their communities and should be held accountable through prosecution and incarceration regardless of social disadvantages. These public relations efforts have generated mixed responses from the public, with some viewing them as genuine community support, while others see them as cynical attempts to shield criminal organizations from scrutiny and law enforcement action. Whatever the public perception of their community activities, the criminal operations and violence perpetrated by New Zealand's gangs continued to escalate through the 2010s, culminating in increasingly brazen acts. The escalation of gang violence in New Zealand has been marked by numerous high-profile incidents, ranging from mass brawls to targeted assassinations, that have shocked the public and prompted intensive law enforcement responses. On the 23rd of April 2006, a mass brawl erupted at Auckland International Airport involving members of the Hells Angels and their support network confronting members of a rival gang. The confrontation occurred in the domestic terminal arrivals area during mid-afternoon, with dozens of participants engaging in violent fighting using fists, feet, and improvised weapons in full view of travelers and airport staff. The incident resulted in multiple serious injuries and one death when a man was beaten and stomped by multiple attackers. Police arrested numerous individuals at the scene and in subsequent investigations, though the public nature of the violence and its occurrence in one of New Zealand's busiest transport hubs generated widespread shock and calls for stronger measures against gang activity. Targeted assassinations of gang members became increasingly common through the 2000s and 2010s as conflicts over methamphetamine distribution territories and personal vendettas motivated killings. In 2008, a mongrel mob member was shot dead outside his home in Wanganui in an attack that police attributed to rival gang members. The shooting occurred in a residential street in early evening, with the victim hit multiple times by gunfire from a vehicle that fled immediately after the attack. Similar incidents occurred in cities and towns throughout New Zealand with sufficient frequency that gang-related shootings became regular features in news coverage. Drive-by shootings, which had been rare in New Zealand prior to the 2000s, became more prevalent as gangs acquired firearms and adopted them as tools for attacks on rivals. In 2013, multiple drive-by shootings occurred in South Auckland over a period of several weeks, as conflicts between gangs escalated. Shots were fired at homes where gang members or their associates lived, at vehicles, and at gang members on the street. While many of these shootings resulted in property damage rather than casualties, several resulted in injuries, and the overall pattern created fear in affected communities, where residents felt caught in crossfire between warring gangs. Funeral services for deceased gang members frequently became sites of violence as rival gangs sought to attack mourners, or as tensions within gangs themselves erupted. In 2016, violence broke out at a funeral in Hamilton when members of rival gangs confronted each other near the service venue. The resulting brawl involved dozens of participants and required significant police response to bring under control. Similar incidents at gang funerals occurred in various locations, with some services requiring heavy police presence to prevent violence and others proceeding without incident, depending on the specific circumstances and relationships between gangs at the time. Public spaces became battlegrounds as gang conflicts spilled beyond gang-controlled territories into shopping centers, streets, and entertainment districts. In 2018, a fight between gang members at a shopping mall in Christchurch resulted in multiple injuries and terrified shoppers who witnessed the violence. Such incidents demonstrated the willingness of gang members to engage in violence regardless of location or the presence of bystanders, creating perceptions that gang violence could occur anywhere rather than being confined to specific gang-affected neighborhoods. Innocent bystanders were occasionally caught in gang violence, though the frequency was lower than in some countries with more prevalent gang activity. In 2019, a young child was injured when a home was shot at in what police described as a case of mistaken identity, with gang members targeting a house they believed was associated with rivals, but which was actually occupied by an unrelated family. Such incidents, while relatively rare, generated intense public reaction and pressure on authorities to take stronger action against gangs. Retaliation cycles between gangs created sustained periods of violence where attacks prompted counterattacks in ongoing sequences that lasted weeks or months. These cycles were driven by gang culture that demanded violent response to any perceived slight or attack, making de-escalation difficult once violence began. Police efforts to interrupt retaliation cycles through arrests, increased patrols, and negotiations with gang leaders had varying success, with some conflicts eventually subsiding while others continued or reignited after brief pauses. The use of firearms in gang violence increased substantially from the 2000s onward. While earlier gang violence had relied primarily on fists, feet, and improvised weapons, the availability of firearms and their adoption by gang members escalated both the lethality and public fear associated with gang conflicts. Weapons seized in police operations included handguns, semi-automatic rifles, shotguns, and occasionally military-style firearms, though the majority of firearms used in gang violence were pistols or rifles obtained through theft, illegal importation, or purchase from licensed firearms owners who sold to criminals. High-profile victims of gang violence included not only gang members themselves, but also individuals who had left gangs or who had become advocates against gang culture. Several former gang members who had publicly renounced gang life and worked to discourage youth from joining gangs were targeted, and in some cases killed. Attacks that demonstrated both the difficulty of leaving gang life and the intolerance of gangs for public criticism from former members who possessed insider knowledge of gang operations. Violence between chapters of the same gang added another dimension to gang conflict. Internal disputes over leadership, money, or perceived violations of gang rules sometimes escalated into violence between chapters that were nominally part of the same organization. These internal conflicts demonstrated that gang violence was not solely about rivalry between different gangs, but also about power struggles and disputes within gang structures. The intensity of violence varied across regions and time periods, with certain areas experiencing sustained high levels of gang violence, while others saw sporadic incidents. Auckland consistently recorded the highest absolute numbers of gang-related violent incidents due to its large population and concentration of gang members, while smaller cities and towns sometimes experience disproportionate impacts when conflicts erupted in communities with limited resources to respond. Women associated with gangs, whether as partners of gang members or as members themselves, were occasionally targets or perpetrators of violence. While gang culture remained predominantly male and most violence involved male participants, women in gang environments experienced violence and in some cases participated in violent incidents on behalf of gangs or in gang-related disputes. These incidents of violence, occurring with increasing frequency through the 2010s and into the 2020s, demonstrated the willingness of gang members to engage in brazen acts of violence in public spaces with little apparent concern for consequences or public safety. The escalation of violence, combined with growing public concern, prompted successive New Zealand governments to implement increasingly aggressive law enforcement strategies and legislative responses. New Zealand law enforcement's response to gang activity has evolved over decades from reactive policing to sophisticated organized crime investigations, though challenges remain in effectively disrupting gang operations and reducing membership. Police responses to emerging gang activity in the 1960s and 1970s were largely reactive and uncoordinated, with individual officers and local stations responding to specific incidents of violence or crime as they occurred, but without systematic strategies for addressing gangs as organizations. This approach reflected both limited understanding of gang dynamics and insufficient resources to dedicate to what was initially perceived as localized youth crime rather than organized criminal activity. As gangs expanded and their criminal operations became more sophisticated through the 1980s and 1990s, law enforcement approaches began to shift toward more proactive and coordinated strategies. The establishment of dedicated gang units within police districts marked an early step toward more systematic responses. These units, staffed by officers with specialized knowledge of gang structures, symbols, and activities, focused on gathering intelligence about gang operations, identifying key members and leaders, and conducting investigations into gang-related crimes. Gang units developed expertise in understanding gang hierarchies, territorial divisions, and the relationships between different gangs, knowledge that proved valuable in predicting and responding to gang conflicts and criminal activities. The Organised and Financial Crime Agency, New Zealand, established in the early 2000s, represented a more sophisticated institutional response to gang-related organised crime. The agency brought together police, customs, and other law enforcement personnel to target serious organised crime, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and other offenses in which gangs were heavily involved. The agency's approach emphasized following financial trails, disrupting criminal networks through targeting their economic foundations, and coordinating investigations across different law enforcement organizations. Operation ARC, launched in 2012, targeted gang-controlled methamphetamine distribution networks in multiple regions simultaneously through coordinated raids and arrests. The operation involved hundreds of police officers executing search warrants at gang properties and arresting dozens of gang members on drug trafficking and related charges. Police seized quantities of methamphetamine, cannabis, firearms, vehicles, and cash, and laid hundreds of charges against gang members. Similar large-scale operations were conducted periodically with names such as Operation Nova, Operation Darnell, and Operation Notice, each targeting specific gangs or criminal networks and resulting in arrests, seizures, and prosecutions. Legislative changes provided law enforcement with additional tools for combating gang activity. The Proceeds of Crime Act, enhanced through various amendments, allowed authorities to seize assets believed to have been acquired through criminal activity or used in the commission of crimes. Houses, vehicles, motorcycles, cash, and other property owned by convicted gang members were seized under proceeds of crime provisions, with the intention of disrupting gang operations by removing their financial resources and deterring membership by demonstrating that criminal profits would not be retained. Seizures under the Act totaled millions of dollars annually by the 2010s, though the extent to which such seizures actually disrupted gang operations remained debatable. Proposals to ban gang patches in public spaces emerged periodically through the 2000s and 2010s as politicians and communities sought ways to reduce the visible presence and intimidation associated with gang colours. Wanganui, a city in the lower North Island with significant gang activity, implemented a local bylaw in 2009 prohibiting display of gang insignia in specified areas of the city centre. The bylaw generated legal challenges and debate about whether such restrictions infringed on freedom of expression, while supporters argued they reduced gang intimidation of the public. Other local authorities considered similar measures, though implementation and enforcement proved challenging, and the effectiveness of such bans in actually reducing gang activity was questionable. Criminal organization provisions within legislation allowed charges to be laid against individuals for participation in organized criminal groups, with the intention of targeting gang membership itself rather than requiring proof of specific criminal acts. These provisions faced legal challenges regarding definition of criminal organizations and proof of membership, and convictions under such provisions required substantial evidence of the organized nature of gang activities and the defendant's role within the organization. Prosecutors utilized these provisions in cases involving serious gang-related offending, though they remained a relatively small portion of overall gang-related prosecutions. Prosecution of gang members faced significant challenges that limited the effectiveness of law enforcement efforts. Witness intimidation was endemic, with gang members threatening or assaulting witnesses to prevent them from providing statements to police or testifying in court. The code of silence within gang culture meant that victims of gang violence, who were themselves gang members or associates, rarely cooperated with investigations, even when they had been seriously injured. Community members in gang-affected areas often refuse to cooperate with police due to fear of retaliation, making investigations into gang crimes difficult even when witnesses were present. Prison management of gang populations presented ongoing challenges as gangs maintained their structures and operations within correctional facilities. Gangs controlled parts of some prisons, with members able to associate freely, conduct gang business, and intimidate non-gang prisoners and occasionally staff. Efforts to separate gang members from different organizations to prevent violence within prisons were complicated by the large numbers of gang-affiliated inmates and limited facility capacity. The use of prisons as recruitment grounds where non-gang offenders were inducted into gangs during their sentences undermined rehabilitation efforts and contributed to gang growth. The Gang Intelligence Centre, established within New Zealand Police in the 2010s, centralised collection and analysis of gang-related intelligence from across the country. The centre maintained databases of gang members, tracked gang activities and conflicts, and provided intelligence support to operational units conducting gang investigations. Information about gang structures, leadership, criminal activities, and inter-gang relationships was compiled and analysed to identify targets for investigation and to anticipate potential gang conflicts that might require preventive police intervention. Surveillance technologies, including CCTV cameras in public spaces and monitoring of gang communications, provided additional tools for gathering evidence and tracking gang activities. Police sought and obtained warrants to intercept communications between gang members discussing criminal activities, though such interceptions required substantial justification and legal authorization. Evidence gathered through surveillance was used in prosecutions, though the technical sophistication of some gang operations and their awareness of police methods sometimes limited the effectiveness of surveillance. Community policing initiatives attempted to address gang recruitment and activity through engagement with at-risk youth and communities. Programs providing positive alternatives to gang membership, mentoring relationships between police and young people, and police participation in community activities aim to build trust and redirect potential gang recruits toward legitimate pathways. The effectiveness of such programs varied, with some individuals successfully avoiding gang involvement through police mentoring and support, while others joined gangs despite such interventions. The prevention versus suppression debate regarding gang policy divided law enforcement, policymakers, and communities. Suppression approaches emphasized arrests, prosecutions, and incarceration of gang members to remove them from communities and deter others from joining. Prevention approaches focused on addressing the social conditions that produced gang membership and providing alternatives for at-risk youth. Police responses incorporated elements of both approaches, though the balance between them shifted with changes in government policy, public pressure, and resource availability. Measuring the success of law enforcement efforts against gangs proved difficult. Arrests and convictions of gang members could be quantified, as could seizures of drugs, weapons, and assets. However, gang membership continued to grow despite these enforcement activities, suggesting that removing individual members through prosecution had limited impact on the overall strength and operations of gang organizations. New members replaced those who were imprisoned. gang structures proved resilient to leadership arrests, and criminal operations adapted to law enforcement tactics. Police estimates of gang membership provided one metric for assessing the gang problem's trajectory. In 2000, police estimated approximately 4,000 patched or prospective gang members nationwide. By 2010, this estimate had grown to approximately 5,000, and by 2020, it had exceeded 8,000. The sustained growth in gang membership, despite decades of law enforcement efforts and millions of dollars in resources dedicated to combating gangs, indicated the limitations of suppression-focused strategies in addressing what was fundamentally a social problem with criminal manifestations. Despite decades of enforcement efforts and significant resources dedicated to combating gang activity, New Zealand's gang membership continued to grow, with police estimates suggesting over 8,000 patched or prospective members by the early 2020s, indicating the limited success of suppression-focused strategies. The persistence of gang activity, despite law enforcement pressure, can be attributed in part to the gang's evolving international connections and sophisticated criminal networks that extend far beyond New Zealand's borders. New Zealand gangs' criminal operations have increasingly relied on international connections, particularly with Asian organized crime syndicates supplying methamphetamine precursors and finished product, as well as networks extending to Australia and the Pacific Islands. The globalization of New Zealand's gang activities accelerated through the 1990s and 2000s as domestic criminal markets became saturated and opportunities for expansion required access to international suppliers and distribution channels. The methamphetamine trade, in particular, necessitated international connections, as the precursor chemicals required for manufacture were predominantly produced in Asian countries, and finished methamphetamine was often more profitably imported than manufactured domestically, given the risks and technical requirements of local production. Chinese organized crime syndicates, particularly triads based in mainland China and Hong Kong, became primary suppliers of both precursor chemicals and finished methamphetamine to New Zealand gangs. These syndicates operated sophisticated smuggling networks, utilizing shipping containers, air cargo, and individual couriers to move drugs and chemicals into New Zealand. Gangs established relationships with specific syndicates through intermediaries, often New Zealand-based Chinese criminals who acted as brokers between the gangs and their Asian suppliers. Payments for drug shipments involved complex money laundering arrangements, including transfers through multiple bank accounts, physical cash movements, and occasionally trade-based schemes, where legitimate goods were used to disguise financial flows. Major drug seizures through the 2000s and 2010s revealed the scale of international supply relationships. In 2016, police and customs intercepted a shipment containing 494 kilograms of methamphetamine concealed in a container of steel reinforcing mesh arriving from China. With an estimated street value of approximately $494 million. The seizure, one of the largest in New Zealand history, led to arrests of both gang members and individuals connected to Asian organized crime, demonstrating the cooperation between these groups in large-scale drug importation. Similar large seizures occurred with sufficient frequency to indicate that successful importations likely occurred at similar or greater scales. Mexican drug cartels had indirect connections to New Zealand's drug market through multi-stage distribution networks. Cocaine produced in South America and distributed by Mexican cartels reached New Zealand through routes involving multiple countries and criminal organizations, with gangs purchasing cocaine from suppliers in Australia or Asia, rather than dealing directly with cartels. The complexity of these supply chains made interdiction difficult and ensured that even when specific shipments were seized, alternative supply routes remained available. Australian connections became increasingly significant for New Zealand gangs, particularly as Australian-based outlaw motorcycle clubs expanded their operations and as deportations of New Zealand-born criminals from Australia to New Zealand increased. The Comancheros, an Australian outlaw motorcycle club with origins in Sydney, established a chapter in New Zealand in the 2010s, bringing with them the more violent and business-focused approach that characterized Australian gang culture. Other Australian motorcycle clubs, including the Rebels and Bandidos, also established presences in New Zealand or developed relationships with existing gangs. Deportations from Australia profoundly impacted New Zealand's gang landscape. Australian law changes in 2014 expanded the categories of non-citizen criminals subject to deportation, resulting in hundreds of New Zealand-born individuals, many with extensive criminal records and gang affiliations in Australia, being deported to New Zealand. These deportees, often called 501s, in reference to the section of Australian immigration law under which they were deported, brought with them experience in more sophisticated and violent criminal operations than had been typical in New Zealand. Many joined existing gangs or established new chapters, contributing to both increased sophistication of gang operations and escalation of violence. Pacific Island routes for drug trafficking utilized New Zealand's close relationships and migration patterns with island nations including Tonga, Samoa, Fiji, and the Cook Islands. Drugs were shipped through these countries on routes to New Zealand, or moved between New Zealand and the islands to service local markets or to facilitate onward distribution. Gang members with family connections in the Pacific travelled regularly between New Zealand and the islands, sometimes using these trips to coordinate drug movements or to escape law enforcement attention temporarily. The limited law enforcement resources in many Pacific Island nations made them attractive transit points for drug trafficking operations. Money laundering through international channels became necessary as gang proceeds from drug trafficking reached levels that could not be effectively laundered domestically. Cash was physically transported out of New Zealand to be deposited in overseas bank accounts, with couriers carrying substantial sums on international flights. Electronic transfers moved money through series of accounts in different countries, often utilizing jurisdictions with limited financial transparency or cooperation with New Zealand authorities. Investment in overseas property, businesses, and other assets provided additional means of legitimizing criminal proceeds while moving wealth beyond the reach of New Zealand authorities. Container shipping provided the primary method for large-scale drug and precursor chemical importation. The volume of container traffic through New Zealand ports, particularly Auckland, made comprehensive inspection of containers impossible, and criminal organizations exploited this by concealing drugs within legitimate cargo or in specially constructed compartments within containers. Corruption of port workers, freight handlers, or other individuals with access to containers facilitated some importations, though most relied on simple concealment and the low probability of the specific container being selected for inspection. Dark web marketplaces and cryptocurrency transactions represented newer dimensions of international gang criminal activity by the 2010s. Some gang members or associates utilized these technologies to purchase drugs, firearms, or other contraband internationally, or to sell drugs to customers within New Zealand and overseas. While the scale of gang involvement in dark web activities remained unclear, law enforcement investigations revealed instances of gang members using these technologies alongside more traditional criminal methods. Comparison between domestic and international operations revealed the substantially greater scale and sophistication of gang activities once international connections were established. Domestic cannabis cultivation or methamphetamine manufacture involved risks of detection and limited production capacity, whereas importation of finished methamphetamine from Asian suppliers allowed gangs to acquire hundreds of kilograms at a time for distribution through their networks. The profits from international drug importation dwarfed those available from domestic production, though the risks and consequences of detection were correspondingly greater. These international connections have made New Zealand gangs part of global criminal networks, significantly increasing both the scale of their operations and the challenges facing domestic law enforcement agencies attempting to disrupt their activities. The international dimension of gang crime has been particularly evident in recent years, as successive governments have grappled with how to address the persistent and growing gang problem. In the early 2020s, New Zealand's gang problem reached unprecedented levels, with membership numbers at historic highs, ongoing violence dominating news cycles, and intense political debate about how to effectively address organized criminal gangs. The COVID-19 pandemic and associated government responses had paradoxical effects on gang activity during 2020 and 2021. Lockdown measures that restricted movement and closed businesses initially disrupted methamphetamine distribution networks as international supply chains were interrupted and domestic distribution became more difficult under travel restrictions. Drug prices increased substantially during lockdown periods as supply decreased, though demand from users remained steady or increased as people confined to their homes sought chemical relief from the stress and boredom of restrictions. Gangs adapted by establishing new distribution methods that complied with lockdown rules on the surface while continuing drug dealing, and by increasing recruitment efforts targeting young people who were isolated from normal social structures during extended periods of online schooling and limited social contact. The economic disruption caused by pandemic restrictions also drove gang recruitment as unemployment increased and legitimate economic opportunities contracted. Young people who might otherwise have found entry-level employment instead faced job markets with few openings, making the income available through gang-affiliated drug dealing more attractive. Communities already suffering from economic disadvantage experienced compounded hardship during the pandemic, creating conditions that historically had proven conducive to gang growth. Gang membership estimates by 2023 exceeded 8,500, according to police figures, representing an increase of more than 50% over a decade and marking the highest recorded gang membership in New Zealand history. The Mongrel Mob remained the largest single gang, with an estimated 2,000 or more members, followed by Black Power with approximately Ansem 500 members, and various other gangs, including the Headhunters, Killer Bees, Tribesmen, and outlaw motorcycle clubs, accounting for the remainder. These figures included both fully patched members and prospects in various stages of gang affiliation, though the distinction between formal membership and association had become increasingly blurred in some gangs. Violence continued at elevated levels through the early 2020s, with numerous high-profile incidents maintaining public attention on gang activity. In 2021, a mass shooting in Auckland resulted in multiple casualties when gang members attacked a property associated with rivals, firing numerous shots in a residential area during daytime hours. The brazen nature of the attack and its occurrence in a populated suburb generated widespread public concern about gang violence, spilling into areas previously considered safe from such activity. Similar incidents occurred with sufficient frequency that gang-related shootings became almost routine news items in cities with high gang populations. Political responses to gang activity intensified as the gang problem became a significant electoral issue. The 2023 general election saw all major political parties proposing policies to address gangs, ranging from enhanced law, enforcement, and tougher sentences to expanded social programs aimed at prevention. The National Party proposed legislation to ban gang patches in public places nationwide, building on earlier local government efforts in specific districts. The Labour government had introduced the Firearms Prohibition Order scheme, allowing courts to ban gang members from possessing firearms and to conduct warrantless searches of their properties for weapons, though implementation and effectiveness of the scheme remain subjects of debate. Gang patch legislation debates revealed divisions in approaches to gang policy. Proponents argued that banning patches would reduce gang intimidation of communities and undermine gang identity and cohesion, citing examples from other jurisdictions where similar measures had been implemented. Opponents countered that patch bans would simply drive gang activity underground without addressing underlying causes of gang membership, and that such restrictions infringed on freedom of expression while being difficult to enforce effectively. Some gang leaders publicly stated they would ignore patch bans and accept arrests as consequences, suggesting that enforcement would require sustained police resources to be effective. Public safety concerns drove much of the political attention to gangs, with polling consistently showing that voters ranked gang crime as a significant issue and that communities in gang-affected areas felt unsafe and underserved by government responses. Media coverage of gang violence, particularly incidents involving firearms or occurring in public places, reinforced perceptions that gang activity was escalating beyond authorities' ability to control. Politicians from various parties competed to propose the toughest measures against gangs, creating a political environment where nuanced discussion of gang causes and solutions was often overwhelmed by promises of enhanced suppression. The prevention versus punishment debate continued to divide experts, policymakers, and communities. Law enforcement officials generally supported enhanced penalties, increased police powers, and more aggressive prosecution of gang members, arguing that gangs were criminal organizations that needed to be disrupted through arrests and incarceration. Social service providers and some researchers emphasized that gangs were symptoms of deeper social problems, including poverty, educational failure, and lack of economic opportunity, and that effective long-term solutions required addressing these root causes rather than simply incarcerating more gang members. Current police strategies combined elements of suppression and prevention, with dedicated gang units conducting investigations and operations targeting serious gang crime, while community policing initiatives attempted to provide alternatives for at-risk youth. The balance between these approaches varied by district and was influenced by available resources, with urban areas generally having more sophisticated gang units, while smaller towns relied more on general policing responses. The effectiveness of these varied approaches remained difficult to measure, as gang membership continued growing despite decades of varying strategies. Community perspectives on gangs remained divided along lines similar to earlier decades. Residents of gang-affected areas often expressed frustration with both gang activity and what they perceived as inadequate government responses, feeling trapped between gang violence and intimidation on one side and insufficient protection and support from authorities on the other. Some community members defended certain gang members as family or friends who had been failed by society, while simultaneously condemning gang violence and drug dealing. These contradictory positions reflected the reality that gangs were not external forces invading communities, but rather were embedded within them through family and social connections. Expert assessments of New Zealand's gang situation in the 2020s generally concluded that the problem had worsened despite sustained attention and resources, and that no clear consensus existed on effective solutions. Academic research emphasized the complex interplay of historical, social, economic, and cultural factors that produced gang membership, arguing that simplistic tough-on-crime approaches had demonstrably failed to reduce gang numbers or activity. Law enforcement officials acknowledged the limitations of enforcement-focused strategies while arguing that public safety required continued aggressive action against gang crime, even if such action did not address underlying causes. As of the mid-2020s, New Zealand continues to grapple with a gang problem that has proven resistant to decades of varying law enforcement and social policy approaches, with no clear consensus on effective solutions. To understand the current state of New Zealand's gangs requires examining not just their criminal operations, but also the social conditions that continue to drive recruitment and membership. The persistence of gang membership in New Zealand, despite law enforcement efforts, can be largely attributed to ongoing social deprivation, intergenerational cycles of membership, and the sense of identity and belonging that gangs provide to marginalized young people. Intergenerational patterns of gang membership have become deeply entrenched in communities where gangs have operated for multiple decades. Children born in the 1990s and 2000s to parents who were gang members in the 1970s and 1980s grew up in households where gang affiliation was normalized as part of family identity. These children often wore gang colors from early ages, attended gang events with their families, and absorbed gang culture as a natural part of their upbringing. When they reached adolescence, joining the same gang as their fathers, uncles, or older siblings appeared less as a choice than as an inevitable progression into their inherited identity. Research into gang recruitment patterns documented numerous cases of three-generation gang families where grandfathers, fathers, and sons were all members of the same gang. In some families, the pattern extended to 4 generations, with great-grandfathers having been founding members of gangs in the 1960s and their descendants maintaining membership through subsequent decades. This intergenerational transmission created situations where gang membership was effectively hereditary in certain families, with children facing enormous pressure to join and severe consequences if they refused or attempted to affiliate with rival gangs. Socioeconomic conditions in areas with high gang populations have shown little improvement over the decades, despite various government interventions and social programs. South Auckland suburbs, Porirua, parts of the Waikato region, and Hawke's Bay continued to rank among the most economically disadvantaged areas in New Zealand through the 2010s and 2020s. Unemployment rates remained above national averages, household incomes were lower, educational attainment was poorer, and health outcomes were worse than in more affluent areas. These persistent disadvantages created environments where legitimate pathways to economic security and social status remained limited for many young people. Youth unemployment in gang-affected communities was particularly severe, with young Maori and Pacific Islander men facing unemployment rates substantially higher than their Pākehā counterparts and higher than youth in more affluent areas. Without access to stable employment that offered decent wages and prospects for advancement, many young men found the income available through gang-affiliated drug dealing or other criminal activity to be their most viable economic option. The financial support that gangs provided to members, including assistance with housing, vehicles, and daily expenses, offered material benefits that legitimate employment in low-wage service or manual labor positions could not match. Educational trajectories for many gang members followed consistent patterns of early disengagement from schooling. High rates of truancy, suspension, and early school leaving characterized the educational experiences of young people who subsequently joined gangs. Factors contributing to educational failure included lack of parental support in households affected by gang activity and substance abuse, behavioral problems stemming from exposure to violence and dysfunction, and discrimination or low expectations from schools and teachers. Students who left school without qualifications faced severely limited employment prospects, making gang membership more attractive as an alternative source of income and status. The prison pipeline that connected schools to correctional facilities through the criminal justice system played a significant role in gang recruitment. Young people arrested for offences during adolescence entered a justice system that often resulted in custodial sentences in youth facilities or adult prisons. Within these institutions, they encountered gang members who recruited them, offering protection from violence and providing structure and belonging. Upon release, newly inducted gang members returned to their communities with gang affiliations that shaped their subsequent life trajectories and made disengagement difficult. Cultural identity appeals formed a central element of gang recruitment, particularly for Maori youth. Gangs presented themselves as expressions of Maori resistance to colonization and ongoing marginalization, framing membership as a way of asserting Maori identity and rejecting Pākehā society that had failed to provide opportunities or respect. The incorporation of Maori cultural elements, including language, symbolism, and concepts of wānau and manakitanga, into gang culture made membership appear culturally authentic rather than simply criminal. For young Maori seeking connection to cultural identity while facing barriers to participation in mainstream Maori institutions such as marae and iwi organizations, gangs offered accessible pathways to Maori identity, even if those pathways were fundamentally distorted. Family and one-hour connection narratives emphasized by gangs resonated with young people from dysfunctional or fragmented families. Gangs presented themselves as surrogate families that would provide unconditional support, loyalty, and belonging regardless of individual circumstances. This appeal was particularly powerful for young people who had experienced family breakdown, foster care placements, or rejection by biological families. The gang's promise of permanent brotherhood and mutual obligation offered emotional security that many recruits had never experienced in their actual families. Alternative pathways for young people in gang-affected communities remain severely limited despite various youth programs and services. Sports programs, arts initiatives, employment training schemes, and mentoring services existed in many communities, but operated at scales insufficient to serve all at-risk youth. These programs also struggled to compete with gangs' immediate offerings of identity, belonging, income, and status. Young people who participated in positive programs still lived in communities saturated with gang presence and often faced pressure from gang-affiliated family members or peers to join gangs regardless of their involvement in alternative activities. The normalization of gang culture in certain communities made gang membership appear inevitable rather than deviant. Children who grew up seeing patched gang members as constant presences in their neighborhoods, who had gang members in their extended families, and who absorbed gang values and symbolism from early ages, often could not envision futures that did not involve gang affiliation. Schools, churches, and community organizations that attempted to provide alternative visions of success faced the challenge of counteracting pervasive gang culture that surrounded young people in their daily lives. Contrast between the ease of gang recruitment and the difficulty of gang exit demonstrated the asymmetric nature of gang membership. Joining a gang required only willingness to participate in gang activities and acceptance by existing members, a process that could be completed in weeks or months. Leaving a gang, however, involved rejection of identity, separation from social networks, potential violence from former gang associates who viewed departure as betrayal, and entry into a society that offered limited support or opportunities for ex-gang members. Exit programs reported success rates well below 50%, with many individuals who attempted to leave gangs eventually returning due to social isolation, economic difficulties, or pressure from former associates. These social factors have created a self-perpetuating cycle where each generation of gang members recruits the next, with children growing up in environments where gang membership appears both normal and inevitable, particularly in the absence of alternative pathways to identity, income, and belonging. The challenge of breaking this cycle has led to various intervention and prevention programs, though their effectiveness remains a subject of considerable debate. Alongside law enforcement approaches, New Zealand has seen various attempts at gang prevention and intervention programs, ranging from youth mentoring initiatives to formal gang exit support services. Though such programs have faced significant challenges and mixed results. Government-funded prevention programs have targeted at-risk youth in gang-affected communities through various approaches since the 1990s. Youth workers employed by community organizations and government agencies worked with young people identified as vulnerable to gang recruitment, providing mentoring relationships, organized activities, and connections to education and employment opportunities. Programs such as He Korowai Trust in the Waikato region and various initiatives operated by iwi and community groups in South Auckland, Porirua, and other areas with high gang populations attempted to engage youth before they became fully entrenched in gang culture. Gang exit services emerged in the 2000s as awareness grew that some gang members sought to leave but faced substantial barriers to doing so. Organizations, including the Salvation Army, various church groups, and dedicated gang exit programs, offered support to individuals attempting to disengage from gangs. Services provided included assistance with finding employment and housing, support through the often dangerous process of formally leaving a gang, relocation to areas away from former gang associates, and ongoing mentoring to help maintain distance from gang culture. The Specialist Gang Exit Program, operated by the Department of Corrections, targeted prisoners seeking to leave gangs before their release, providing support both during incarceration and after return to the community. Employment and training initiatives recognize that legitimate economic opportunities were essential for both preventing gang recruitment and supporting gang exit. Programs providing trades training, job placement assistance, and support for small business development targeted young people and former gang members. Some programs worked with employers to encourage hiring of individuals with gang backgrounds, addressing the discrimination that made employment difficult for those with gang affiliations or criminal records. Success in these programs varied, with some participants obtaining stable employment and avoiding gang involvement, while others found the barriers too substantial to overcome. Challenges facing intervention and prevention programs were numerous and substantial. Funding for such programs was often inadequate to the scale of the problem, with waiting lists for services and insufficient staff to provide intensive support to all those who might benefit. Programs operated in difficult environments where gang culture was pervasive and where participants faced ongoing pressure from gang-affiliated family members and peers. Sustainability of programs was uncertain, with many relying on short-term government contracts or charitable funding that could be withdrawn, leaving communities without services that had begun to show promise. Measuring success in gang prevention and intervention proved difficult given the complexity of factors influencing gang membership decisions and life trajectories. Programs could document numbers of participants, instances of service provision, and short-term outcomes such as school enrollment or job placement. But long-term outcomes regarding sustained avoidance of gang membership or successful gang exit were harder to track. Follow-up studies of program participants years after involvement were rare, making evidence-based assessment of program effectiveness challenging. Success stories provided evidence that gang prevention and exit was possible with appropriate support. Individuals who had successfully left gangs and rebuilt lives in legitimate employment or education appeared in media coverage and program promotional materials, offering hope that gang trajectories were not inevitable. Some former gang members became anti-gang advocates or worked in intervention programs themselves, using their insider knowledge and credibility to reach at-risk youth and current gang members. These success stories, while genuine, represented minorities of those who attempted to avoid or leave gangs. Failure rates and recidivism among those attempting to exit gangs were high. Studies of gang exit programs found that substantial majorities of participants returned to gang activity within 1 to 2 years of attempting to leave. Factors contributing to return included inability to find stable employment, social isolation from non-gang networks, ongoing gang violence or threats that made complete disengagement impossible, and the pull of gang identity and belonging that remained powerful even for those intellectually committed to leaving. The difficulty of gang exit demonstrated that programs, however well designed, could not easily counteract the accumulated effects of years of socialization into gang culture and the structural factors that made gang membership attractive. Community-led programs operated by local organizations with deep roots in affected areas sometimes achieved better engagement than government-run initiatives, as community organizations had established trust and cultural understanding that government agencies lacked. Programs led by Maori and Pacific Islander community groups and operating with cultural frameworks appropriate to their participants showed promise in some areas. However, community organizations often struggled with limited funding, volunteer burnout, and the same challenges of scale and sustainability that affected all intervention efforts. Restorative justice approaches applied to gang-related offending attempted to address harm caused by gang crime while providing pathways for offenders to make amends and reintegrate into communities. These approaches involved bringing together offenders, victims, and community members to discuss the impacts of offending and to develop plans for reparation and rehabilitation. Application of restorative justice to gang contexts was challenging given the serious nature of much gang crime and the difficulties of securing participation from gang members and communities affected by gang violence. The limited scale of intervention and prevention efforts compared to the size of the gang problem meant that most at-risk youth and current gang members never engaged with such programs. With thousands of young people at high risk of gang recruitment and thousands more already in gangs, programs serving dozens or at most hundreds of individuals annually could not substantially alter overall gang membership trends. Advocates for expanded programs argued that adequately resourced and scaled prevention and intervention efforts could significantly reduce gang recruitment and support gang exit, while critics questioned whether such programs could ever compete effectively with the powerful attractions and embedded nature of gang culture. While some individuals have successfully exited gang life with support from intervention programs, the scale of such efforts has remained limited compared to the size of the gang problem, and recidivism rates remain high among those who attempt to leave. The contrast between the limited success of intervention programs and the ongoing growth of gang membership reflects the complex and deeply rooted nature of New Zealand's gang problem. While gang activity exists in many countries, New Zealand's situation exhibits both similarities to international patterns and distinctive characteristics shaped by the country's small population, colonial history, and social structure. Per capita gang membership rates in New Zealand rank among the highest in the developed world. With an estimated 500 gang members in a population of approximately 5 million people, New Zealand has roughly 170 gang members per 100,000 population. This rate exceeds comparable figures from most European countries and is higher than many regions of the United States, though lower than some areas with particularly severe gang problems. The concentration of gang membership within specific demographic groups, particularly young Maori and Pacific Islander men, means that the per capita rates within these populations are substantially higher than the national average. Comparison with Australia reveals both similarities and significant differences. Australia has experienced gang problems particularly related to outlaw motorcycle clubs in cities such as Sydney and Melbourne, with violence levels and organisational sophistication comparable to or exceeding those in New Zealand. However, Australian gangs have generally been more fragmented along ethnic and organisational lines, with less dominance by a small number of large organisations, as exists in New Zealand with the mongrel mob and black power. The deportation issue that has seen hundreds of criminals expelled from Australia to New Zealand has created a direct connection between the two countries' gang landscapes, with deportees bringing Australian gang culture and methods to New Zealand. The United States presents a different comparison, given its vastly larger scale and more diverse gang landscape. American cities such as Los Angeles, Chicago, and Baltimore have experienced gang violence and drug trafficking on scales that dwarf New Zealand's problems in absolute terms. However, the ethnic dynamics differ substantially, with American gangs primarily involving African American and Hispanic populations in contexts shaped by American racial history, whereas New Zealand gangs are predominantly Indigenous and Pacific Islander. The decentralized nature of American gang structures, with numerous small gangs operating in limited territories, contrasts with New Zealand's pattern of large organizations with national reach. Unique aspects of New Zealand's gang situation distinguish it from international comparisons. The overwhelming representation of Indigenous Maori in gang membership reflects New Zealand's specific colonial history and ongoing issues of Maori marginalization. In a country where Maori comprise approximately 17% of the population, they account for more than 70% of gang membership, a disproportion that exceeds Indigenous overrepresentation in criminal justice systems in most comparable countries. The small size of New Zealand as a country, with a population of 5 million, means that gang networks can extend nationally more easily than in larger countries, and that gang members from different cities often have connections through family or shared incarceration experiences. The visible patch culture in New Zealand, where gang members openly wear colours and insignia in public spaces, is more pronounced than in many countries where gang activity is present, but less publicly displayed. This visibility reflects both the gang's confidence in their positions within certain communities and the relative tolerance or inability of authorities to prevent such displays. Attempts to ban gang patches have faced legal and practical challenges that have limited their implementation and effectiveness. Historically, lethal violence associated with New Zealand gangs was lower than in countries such as the United States, Mexico, or Brazil, where gang conflicts routinely resulted in multiple homicides. New Zealand gang violence through the 1980s and 1990s, while serious, typically involved assaults and occasional murders rather than the sustained gun battles and massacres seen in countries with more militarized gang conflicts. However, the increasing availability of firearms and the escalation of methamphetamine-related violence in the 2000s and 2010s narrowed this gap. Prison gang density in New Zealand ranks among the highest in the developed world, with gang members comprising substantial portions of prison populations and exercising considerable influence within correctional facilities. This concentration reflects both the high rates of criminal offending among gang members and the use of prisons as recruitment grounds and sites for maintaining gang operations. This comparative perspective reveals that while New Zealand shares common gang-related challenges with other developed nations, the country's unique social history and demographic patterns have created a gang problem with distinctive characteristics requiring locally tailored responses. With this comprehensive understanding of New Zealand's gang landscape from historical origins through current challenges, it becomes possible to assess what the decades of gang activity have meant for the country. In assessing the impact of gangs on New Zealand society over more than half a century, it becomes necessary to weigh the arguments made by those who see gangs as symptomatic of social failure against the reality of their criminal activities and effects on communities. It could be argued that New Zealand's gangs are products of historical injustices and ongoing structural inequalities that have marginalized Maori and Pacific Islander populations since European colonization. The rapid urbanization of Maori in the post-war decades, combined with systematic discrimination in employment, housing, and education, created conditions of severe disadvantage that left young Maori men with limited legitimate opportunities for economic advancement or social status. Gangs emerged in this context as responses to social abandonment rather than as purely criminal choices, providing identity, belonging, and support networks in communities where government services and mainstream institutions had failed. Gangs have incorporated elements of Maori culture, including language, symbolism, and concepts of wānau, into their structures, offering some members connections to cultural identity that they might otherwise have lacked, given the historical suppression of Maori language and culture in New Zealand society. The emphasis on brotherhood, loyalty, and mutual support within gangs reflects traditional Maori values, even if expressed through criminalized structures. Some gang members and their defenders argue that gangs have preserved aspects of Maori identity and resistance to colonization that might otherwise have been lost. The charitable activities that gangs have organized, including Christmas toy distributions, sports programs for youth, and support for community events, have provided tangible benefits to some residents of impoverished areas. Gang members have assisted families in financial difficulties, organized funerals for community members, and in some instances, protected communities from external threats. These activities, while limited in scale and often accompanied by self-serving motivations, have represented genuine instances of gangs contributing positively to their communities. For individual members, particularly those from severely dysfunctional family backgrounds or those who have experienced trauma and marginalization, gangs have provided structure, purpose, and a sense of belonging that was absent from their lives before membership. The gang's offer of unconditional acceptance and support has been meaningful to individuals who had been rejected or abandoned by families, schools, and society. In this sense, gangs have filled voids created by failures of social institutions to provide adequate care and support for vulnerable young people. The reality is far grimmer, though. Whatever social conditions produced gangs, and whatever legitimate needs they may address for some members, the harm that gangs have inflicted on New Zealand communities vastly outweighs any positive contributions. The methamphetamine trade that gangs have controlled and expanded has devastated thousands of lives, destroying families through addiction, creating cycles of criminal behavior to support drug habits, and causing immeasurable physical and psychological damage to users. The communities that gangs claim to represent and protect have borne the greatest burden of gang activity, experiencing violence, intimidation, and drug-related social dysfunction that has degraded quality of life for entire neighborhoods. Violent statistics tell the story of gangs' impacts more clearly than their rhetoric of community support. Thousands of New Zealanders have been victims of gang-related assaults, murders, and other violent crimes over the decades of gang activity. Many victims have been gang members themselves, young men whose lives were ended or permanently damaged in conflicts over drugs, territory, or perceived slights. Others have been family members of gang members, community residents caught in gang conflicts, or individuals targeted for intimidation or exploitation. The normalization of violence in gang-affected communities has traumatized generations of children who have grown up witnessing or experiencing gang-related violence. Economic costs of gang activity extend beyond the direct proceeds of crime. Communities with a heavy gang presence have experienced depressed property values, business closures, and reduced investment that have perpetuated poverty and limited opportunities for residents. Government expenditures on law enforcement, corrections, health services, and social services responding to gang-related problems have diverted resources that could have been used for productive purposes. The wasted potential of thousands of young men who have spent significant portions of their lives engaged in criminal activity, incarcerated, or killed in gang conflicts represents an incalculable loss to New Zealand society. The intergenerational transmission of gang membership has perpetuated cycles of disadvantage and criminality across multiple generations within families and communities. Children born into gang-affiliated families face dramatically increased risks of poor educational outcomes, criminal involvement, incarceration, substance abuse, and violence. The normalization of gang culture in certain communities has made gang membership appear inevitable rather than deviant, trapping successive generations in patterns that limit their life possibilities. Consequently, while the social conditions that created and sustained New Zealand's gangs deserve serious attention and remediation, the gangs themselves have caused immeasurable harm to the very communities they claim to represent, perpetuating cycles of violence, addiction, and poverty across generations. This complex and troubling history raises important questions about how New Zealand should move forward in addressing gang activity and the underlying social issues that sustain it. What do you think of New Zealand's gang problem? Are gangs primarily victims of colonization and social marginalization who provide community support in neglected areas, or are they violent criminal organizations that have devastated communities and perpetuated cycles of harm across generations? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.